this morning, Matthew the 7th chapter, beginning in verse 15. Beware of false prophets. A false prophet, one who speaks from God, or one who speaks for God. I want to expand a little bit, still within the confines of the text in terms of the meaning, but I want to expand a little bit on false prophet, because I think false prophet as a person is too narrow in our age of electronic media. A prophet is identifying one person. So if we have a false prophet, we could identify a Joseph Smith, who was the founder of the Mormon faith, I guess you'd call it, or Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science movement, or Charles Taz Russell, the founder of Jehovah's Witness. We could consider them false prophets as individuals, but I want to expand false prophet to include false teachings and false teachers, because in our age, the electronic media makes false teaching prevalent. It wasn't possible 2,000 years ago. So let's look at the context of verse 15, our text for this morning. The context is Jesus has declared in verse 13 and 14, just a couple sentences prior to our text, he's declared that there is a wide road and a narrow road. So he uses the metaphor of a path or a road. And he says the wide road is the path in life where the going is comfortable. He says it's popular. He says in verse 13, there are many people on this wide road. It's popular, but it leads to destruction. Then he said there's also a narrow path. He said the narrow path can be difficult because the narrow path requires obedience to me, Jesus says. And that path is not occupied by a lot of people. There are few people on that path, but it gives life. Next, after describing metaphorically these two paths, Jesus says, I want you to be on guard against false prophets. Interesting, because it may be that the false prophet that Jesus will now present is the one who encourages you to get on that wide path that he just talked about in verse 13 and 14. So he says, beware. Beware is to be on your guard. It's to take this warning seriously. So you know me, I give 3 points. So point number 1, perhaps the most dangerous false teaching in our time is the teaching that there is no absolute truth. There's no absolute truth. That is a dangerous false teaching in our time. Now let me back into that, and I want you to complete this for me. If there is a false, then that means there must be if there's a false, that means there must be a true, correct. What is truth? Truth is something that is factual. It is something that is true and factual in our lives. Jesus and God's Word are absolute truths. So what do I mean by an absolute truth? An absolute truth is a truth that is factual regardless of what a person thinks about it. An absolute truth must be grounded in something outside of ourselves. Now you can see the reason for that. If absolute truth resides within us, then it's my opinion. No, absolute truth is something that's true regardless of what anybody thinks, and it's grounded in a source outside of ourself. I want to give you some other facts about or requirements of an absolute truth. An absolute truth is objective. It's not subjective. It's constant. It doesn't change. And absolute truth is universal. It applies to everybody. It has no favorites. For instance, Paul writes to the church in Rome, and he says in Romans 3:23, how many have sinned? How many have sinned in Romans 3:23? All. It doesn't say some, it doesn't say most, but it's an absolute truth because it applies to everyone. All have sinned. And absolute truth prevails. It stands to the end. Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word stands forever. Those are features of absolute truth. God's word and Jesus are all of these requirements. And there are even absolute truths in our secular world, the world we live in. An absolute truth. If you step off of a 10-story building, you will fall. You will likely die. An absolute truth. If you take a 9mm, 40 caliber, 45 caliber bullet, or even a 22 for that matter, if you take a bullet to the heart, you will die. Absolute truth. Jeff King flies a Cessna 182, I think. If that Cessna runs out of fuel, it will drop. Absolute truth. If you step out of the boat and try to walk on water, you will get wet. There are absolute truths that are universal, they're objective, they're constant, they don't change. Now, God's word is absolute truth. Let's contrast that with relative truth. Relative truth is each person constructs their own belief about what is true. We call that my truth. My truth. And the proponents of this position will say, and I want you to finish it for me, what's true for me may not be true for you. That's right. What's true for me, that's my truth. That may not be true for you. I have my truth, and I respect your difference. The people who believe in relative truth or my truth, they would say to Christians who believe in absolute truth, well, the idea that I'm wrong, that's disrespectful to me. There's a popular teaching among people who believe in relative truth or my truth. Popular teaching is that all roads lead to God. All roads lead to salvation. It just depends on your sincerity. How sincere you are to your doctrine, because all roads lead to salvation. I read an interesting poll recently of people who are self-described as born-again Christians. The poll found that 1/2 of these born-again Christians do not believe in absolute truth. That's appalling. How can a born-again Christian not believe in absolute truth? God's word is absolute truth. A Christian's belief is based on absolute truth. If we attempt to reduce absolute truth to the most foundational element, what would it be? I think it would be this: God is. I think that's the most basic element of absolute truth. God is. If you don't believe in the absolute truth that God is, nothing else of Christianity makes any sense. God is. That is absolute truth. Here's another absolute truth that is foundational. Jesus is the only way to salvation. Jesus is the only way to be included in God's family. Another absolute truth: all have sinned and deserve eternal death. Absolute truth: without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Plus, in addition to those absolute truths from God's word, there is absolute truth in evidence and in reason. Point number 2, Jesus states, and once you look at verse 16, Jesus states that false prophets or false teaching, as I'm using that word, is identifiable. Look at verse 15. False prophets come to you in sheep's clothing, but are inwardly ravenous wolves. 16. You'll recognize them. Well, Jesus says they can be identified. You recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit. Jesus says that there are false preachers, teachers, prophets. They're identifiable. There are 3 things about these false teachers or false prophets from the text. First, they are deceptive. They're deceptive. Jesus says they come to you in sheep's clothing. John MacArthur has an interesting idea about the sheep's clothing that Jesus is speaking about here. He says shepherds wore wool clothes. That would be the sheep's clothing that Jesus is talking about here. He believes that Jesus is talking about what the shepherds wore. They wore woolen garments. Now, ancient prophets also wore distinctive clothing that would identify them as a prophet. So Jesus is possibly saying here that false shepherds disguise themselves as true shepherds. So first, they're deceptive. Second, they're dangerous. Do you see in the text, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. Ravenous means to be extremely hungry. It's voracious. They preach and they teach what is pleasing, but their teaching destroys. These may be the people that encourage others to go down that wide path. Their teaching is dangerous. So they deceive, they're dangerous. Lastly, they're attractive. They are attractive. You know, the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet in the Old Testament who prophesies around the early 600 BC, so about 50 years before the nation is taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Jeremiah prophesies in chapter 5, in chapter 14, in chapter 23. He speaks about false prophets. Let me paraphrase just a little bit what he says in chapter 5, verse 13. Verse 31. He says this, prophets teach falsely, priests rule at their discretion, and the people love it. Interesting. False prophets are attractive. The false prophets, they teach false information. The priests, they perform their duties just the way they wanted to do them, and the people love it. False prophets. Now, likely today, in the age of our electronic media, it isn't a false prophet as one person. It's a teaching. Because of the media's ability to amalgamate all teaching, we have media that is spewing false teaching. We have it in music. We have it in movies. We have it in sports, in politics, entertainers. When these contradict God's word, and they almost always do in a subtle way, they're false teachers. The predominant message, in addition to there is no absolute truth, the predominant message in addition to that is you and I are God. Small g. You and I are God because we're in charge. We're in control. Here's another message from our society that's subtle. You're entitled. You're entitled. You're entitled to, and you fill in the blank. And that entitlement is based on something intrinsic in you. You know, interesting as we look at our culture today, that idea of entitlement produces a profound sense of ingratitude. We are living, I believe, my personal opinion, we are living in a generation where we have never seen more ungrateful people. Never. We as believers, we're not entitled to anything. There's nothing in God's word that says we're entitled. In fact, as sinners, we're entitled to die apart from God. We as believers should be the most grateful people in the world. You know, you should be able to list immediately 5 or 6 things that you're grateful for. Certainly you're grateful for Jesus and the fact that you're included. Certainly you're grateful that we live in a free country where we can worship. Certainly you're grateful that you can come here. Certainly you're grateful for the other 7 guys around your table that are interested in you. The entitlement produces ingratitude. That Jesus repeats this warning several times, this warning to be on your guard against false teaching. It blends in, and it's difficult to recognize on the surface, but it can be revealed. Jesus says you can know them. You can. They can be revealed by their doctrines. What is doctrine? Doctrine is a belief that is taught. That's doctrine. So false teachers can be identified by what they teach, and by their lives. Jesus says by their, verse 16, by their fruit. What do their lives look like? What does the life of a false teacher look like? Does their life look like a life of pride or humility? Does it look like they are living to gain for themselves, or are they truly concerned for their students or the people that are listening to them? Point number 3. So point number 1, the false teaching it extant in our world today that is so destructive, there's no absolute truth. Point number 2, false teachers can be identified. Jesus says there are ways to know who they are. Point number 3, we are most susceptible to false teaching under one of these 3 conditions. And I have them in one of your questions on your table. One condition is if we are distracted. You know, we can read God's word and our mind wanders. The same with listening to a sermon. We can listen to a sermon and our mind wanders because we're distracted. Last week, my youngest son, Brian, and his son, Colin, came up to my house. Colin is 15, and Brian, my youngest son, said, "Dad, he wants to learn. I want him to teach something about maintenance on a car." And I know growing up, we got a lot of that from you. So he said, can we change the oil in my car? Can Colin do it? I said, sure. So I have a pit in my garage. So we got down in the pit, and the 3 of us were down there. And I showed Colin what drain plug to take out, and then the oil filter's over here. And here's a 14 millimeter wrench, because that's a drain plug. And so he took the drain plug out, and I said, now you want to drop the drain plug into the pan right away, because otherwise you'll have oil running down your arm. And he didn't drop the drain plug. He held on to it, and the oil ran. So anyway, he got the drain, and he put the drain plug back in, and he finger tight, and then he went over to the oil filter because he was going to take that off. And I said, wait. You didn't tighten that drain plug. And he said, well, I was going to, Papa, but I was going to do it after. I said, no. If you get distracted, that car could leave here with a drain plug loose, and that will be disaster. No, when you put the drain plug in, you get the wrench and you tighten it. Distracted. We can be susceptible to false teaching when we're distracted. Our lives can lack focus. We can easily move off course by distraction. You know, one of the distractions in our world is entertainment. We can be distracted by entertainment, and then we're susceptible to false teaching. Second condition is when we're discontent or stressed. When we're stressed by a difficult relationship. That's the number one stress in our lives usually, is a relationship. When it's work, when it's health, when it's finances, these strains can make us open to deceptive teaching that is attractive. Deceptive teaching offers a quick fix. And the third condition that makes us open to false teaching is the condition I call content. Now, contentment means that I think everything is kind of going okay in life, I don't have any relationship issues right now. I'm reasonably healthy. I have enough money and finances works okay. Contentment is actually the precursor to boredom. Contentment is really close to boredom. Boredom opens you up to new experiences and false teaching. So let me recapitulate just in a couple minutes here for us. Jesus commands here, be on guard. Be looking out for false teaching. It's dangerous. It's deceptive. It's attractive. It has as its core a rejection of absolute truth. It can be recognized. The false teaching, the false teacher can be recognized by their core, by not only their doctrine, what they teach, but by their lives. And Jesus says this false teaching is ubiquitous. You know the word. It means it's everywhere present. It's all around us. That's why he warns so often about it. It can be recognized by the teacher's teaching, by their lives. You and I are susceptible to false teaching. Sure, we are. Especially when we're distracted, when we're stressed or discontent, or when we're content bordering on boredom. As you read Jesus' warning here, are you and I answerable to God on how we respond to his warning? Sure we are. Because as we read these words from God's word, we are not only to be responsible to the words, but to the person who says them. That is to God. Okay, I have on your table some questions. It looks formidable because there are 5 of them, and that's contrary to what Jason usually does or presents, but you can get through them. Don't spend too much time on any one question. What do you think? Why do you think Jesus warns so often about recognizing false teaching or false prophets? Secondly, false teaching is contrary to absolute truth. It streams from news, movies, videos, politics, sports, all the social media. Even pastors and Bible teachers can present false teaching. Which the above is most likely to gain your attention to false teaching? And then thirdly, as I spoke just a minute ago, you may be more open to false teaching under one of the following conditions. You're distracted from God's word, you're stressed and discontent, or you're content, satisfied, approaching even boredom in life. Fourthly, I want us to be part of that finding from half of the people who call themselves born-again Christians. I want us to be on that poll, if you will. Do you personally believe there is absolute truth? Do you as a believer believe there is absolute truth? And then lastly, why would a false teacher want to influence you? Okay, see you back in 30 minutes.